Welcome to the VB Toolbox. In this tutorial I'm going to be showing you the basics of arrays. And what an array is essentially is a collection of any data type or object. It could be strings, integers, or even custom classes that you create. It's essentially just a list of those items. They can exist in multiple dimensions. You can have one-dimensional arrays, it's just a top-down list, or two-dimensional arrays that are, aligned in a grid with XY coordinates, or even 3D arrays. In this tutorial I'll be showing you how to create basic one-dimensional and two-dimensional arrays. So let's go ahead and jump in and get started. I'm going to click New Project, and I'm going to select a Windows Forms application. I'm going to name my project My Arrays and hit Enter or OK. Let's start by stretching out our screen for a little extra real estate there. And I'm going to create a couple of controls here to play with. So I'm going to start by creating or adding a couple of buttons. If your toolbox here is not visible, you can click View and select Toolbox from your menu. So either double click or drag the button to your form. And I'm going to just put this over here on the right, and I'm going to get two of those. Alright, and finally I want a text box as well, so I'm going to grab that text box and draw it right here, and we're going to go ahead and make that multi-line. So make sure that's selected, and in your properties dialog go to multi-line and change that value to true, and that'll make it so we can stretch out our text box. Okay, I'm going to scoot that down. I actually want one more control here that I will use. It's just going to be a label control, so you can drag that up there. And let's start by changing the text on the label. So go to your text property, and we'll just type in index and scroll up, and let's just call this LBL index for easy referencing. And on our first button, let's call this one CMD PREV for previous, and we'll go down to the button text and we'll change that to previous, and we will change this one to next for the text, and we'll change the name to CMD next. And what I'm going to be using these buttons for is for looping through our array index. So we want to change the name of this text box as well. So we'll just call this TXT. I'm just going to call TXT output. Now what we can do is double click on our form, and we're going to establish a variable for our first array here. I'm going to call it, let's just say dim my array. And what we'll do for this variable is put open and closing parentheses, and what that does is formulates an array. And what we can also do is specify the maximum number of indexes in that array, or essentially each index is a copy of the variable. So I'm going to go ahead and set this to 9, and then you choose the type of data that you would like to store to that array. So I'm going to say as string. Now let me explain what we've done here. We've created an array of strings with 9, it's actually 10 indexes. These arrays are 0 based, so 0 counts as a value all the way up to 9, so that gives us 10 possible values stored to this array or collection. So next up, let's add one more variable. I'm going to say dim index pos for position. So this will be our index position to store where we are at in our array. So I'm going to store that as an integer, and if you want you can set it to 0. By default, integers have a 0 value, so it's not really necessary to do that. Okay, so now what we need to do is in our form load event we can actually start populating our array. So we'll go ahead and add some values to this. I'm going to put a little note here, populate array, and we'll start with the first index value. So I'm going to say my array parentheses 0 equals, okay, so for each index value you just specify what you want for the information in that. It's a little bit different if you're using objects, and I may show you that a bit later, but for now we're just going to use simple strings. So for index value 0 I'm going to say welcome to the VB toolbox. Alright, and what we can do is just copy this line, and we're going to add a few more values here for fun. And what you do, you increment the index value. So in place 0 we've stored this line, in index place 1 we'll store a new line. We'll say let's begin our lesson. And then I'm going to paste another, and this will go to index value 2. If you don't change that, it'll overwrite whatever index you were using. So let's go ahead and add a few more values here. Today we'll discuss arrays. I'm going to add another. I'll say you're looking at an array this array has only one dimension. And I'm going to go ahead and throw something in the very end just for fun. I'm going to say my array 9 being the final place in our array equals you're at the end of the array. Alright, so there you have it. We've populated a collection of items to our array. So with that we can do anything with these values. We can call them into a text box, we can browse through them individually, you could concatenate every one of them if you wanted to. What I'm going to do is create a sub for scrolling or browsing through our array by the index value. So what I'll do is I'll say private sub next array item, oops, and then I'm going to pass an integer value to specify the number of indexes that we want to toggle or scroll by. So I'm just going to say index as integer. Alright, so then I can pass either a 1 to browse up the list, or I can pass a -1 if I want to browse down the list. And then what I'll say is index position plus equals, and that is an incrementer, okay? So if we have a 0 value and we say plus equals 1, then it will increment that index position by 1. If we pass a -1, it's going to add -1 on there and go backwards. So that's essentially what we're going to do here. I'm going to say the value we want to increment by is index from our parameter up here. Now we need to avoid going outside of the array. If you try calling a value from beyond the boundaries of the array, your application will crash unless you have some sort of error handling. If we try going below 1, for example, to -1, it's going to crash, and if we try going above 9 to say 10 or higher, it'll crash then as well. So what we'll do is we'll create a form of index looping to keep it from ever doing that. So we'll say if the index position is less than 0, then jump to index position 9. Else if index position is greater than 9, then index position equals 0. So in either case, if we try going too high, it'll set it back to the beginning. If we try going too low, it'll jump to the top of the list. So next up, now that we've handled that, we're going to go ahead and just set the label that we added to the count or the index position. So we'll say set index label, and here I'm going to say lbl index dot text property equals, I'm going to just add a string here saying index and put a space after that colon, and then I'm going to concatenate on the index position. So it adds the index position variable's value to this. And finally, we want to return when we have selected a new array item by going to the previous value or the next value. We want to set the value in our txt output to equal the value of the array index. So we'll say my array, and we will call the present index position, just like that. So now that we have that, it's not going to do anything just yet because we haven't actually added any action to these buttons. But one other thing we're going to want to do is probably just specify a default value for our text box. So we can actually test this. Next array item, I'm going to say next array item. Instead of jumping up or jumping down, I'm just going to set it to 0. So it's going to just add 0 to the index position here, leaving it at the very first item here. So let's just test that. Looks like it's working beautifully. It grabbed the first index value. So now we want to be able to browse through our array. I'm going to go ahead and add some action to these buttons. So for the previous value, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to call this next array sub that we created. This time I'm going to say -1 because I want the previous one to go back a step, and then do just the opposite for our next button. If you double click on that, it'll bring you to your click event. I'm going to copy that in there and say +1. So this will try incrementing by -1, and therefore it will remove a value. This one will jump it up by 1. Let's go ahead and test that. And our index is presently 0. Let's go next. Hey, let's begin our lesson. Next, today we'll discuss arrays. Next, you're looking at an array. This array has only one dimension. Alright, and then we didn't set anything for the following values. And then you hit 9 and you're at the end, we hit next again, takes us back to 0 instead of going outside of the array boundaries. And likewise, we can reverse through the array and it will jump back up to 9 when it hits the last one. So that's working beautifully. That's how you browse through arrays. So next up, why don't we learn how to create a two-dimensional array. A two-dimensional array is essentially an XY grid. Think of columns and rows like an Excel spreadsheet or a database. If you want to store data in that format, you can create a two-dimensional array by simply adding to your array a comma and a second value. Now what you have to understand is that when you do this, your array grows exponentially. Okay, so instead of having 9 rows going straight down, you're going to have 9 rows going down once, 9 rows going down twice, all the way up to 9. So it's just going to go, you know, x0 to x9, y0 to y9. So it creates a two-dimensional grid. I'm just going to go ahead and create a second array here for this. I'm also going to throw in some graphics just for fun, so we can get a visual of our grid. So I'm going to jump up above our class here, and I'm going to import our drawing library. I'm going to say imports system.drawing, and this allows us to actually draw to our form using the form's graphics object. So we're going to need a handle, way to reference our graphics object for our form. So I'm going to say, I'm going to say dim g as graphics. Okay, and now when our form loads, we need to actually populate this value. So I'm going to come up down here and say g equals me. That's form 1 dot create graphics. And now we can actually draw to the form as we desire. So let's create another string array. I'm going to do a 3x3 grid. That would be a total of 9 squares, or 9 total variables. So I'm going to say dim str array, just an array of strings, and I'm just going to go 2 by 2. And remember, that's 0 to 2, so that's 3 possible values in each section there. So also as a type string. Alright. So let's go ahead, before we go any further, and draw a physical representation of our grid, just so it's easier to imagine. I'm going to go ahead and just add another command button here and bring it down here to the bottom. And this one I'm just going to I'm going to change the text to 2D string array. See if it'll fit in there. Good, it did. And I'm going to call this button CMD array to D. There we go. That works. Alright. Now with this, let's start by clearing our graphics surface, clearing the form surface. If anything's already drawn on here, we're going to wipe it out with this. So I'm going to say G, being our graphics object, I'm going to call the clear method. And here we can set a color to clear it to. I'm going to use the form's default boring gray color. You can change that if you want to change it to a different color. I'm just going to say g.clear color.fromName, and the name of that boring gray surface is just called control. So put that in quotes, close it, And now when we click that button, any graphics that are on there will be wiped clean like an Etch-a-Sketch. Let's see, now what we're going to do is, let's see, we've given our array three possible values in the X and three possible values on the Y. So it's 0 to 2. I'm going to do the exact same thing, but this time I'm going to loop through those possible values using just sort of an XY marker. So I'm going to say create a loop here for our X and a loop for the Y. I'm going to say for X equals 0 to 2. Okay, so it's going to go 0, 1, 2. Alright, now inside of that, for each X value, I want to loop through my Y values. So 0, 0, 1, 2, 3, 1, 1, 2, 3, and so on. So I'm going to say for Y, whoops, equals 0 to 2 as well. Alright, so it's a loop inside of a loop. For each X value, it's going to loop through all the possible Y values, and then it's going to go to the next X value, again loop through all the possible Y values, and repeat until it reaches the end of the grid. So let's draw a physical representation of this. I'm going to say g.draw rectangle, and I'm just going to make it a black grid, and now we need to specify rectangle positions and sizes to draw. I'm just going to do 64 by 64 pixel rectangles. So what we're going to do is sort of increment it out by multiplying that size, that 64 pixel size, by our X and Y values. So I'm going to say draw a new rectangle at X times the size that we want to draw, which is 64 pixels, and then Y times the size, and then the height and width of that rectangle, and that's pretty simple. Okay, so let's go ahead and run that and just see what happens. Perfect. It drew a grid of rectangles. So each row represents our X value, X0, and then X1, and then X2. And vertically, each column is represented by our Y value. Okay? So let's now go ahead and populate our 2D array with some text values. I'm going to come up here above this, and I'm going to say populate str array with strings. Okay, and we will do it this way. We'll say string array 0, 0. That's the very first square. X0 and Y0. We'll set a string just like we did with these ones. I'm going to say hello, and I'm going to jump to another value here. You can just copy and paste so you don't have to redo everything. And I'm going to set this one to X1, Y0. Say YouTube. And let's just throw a few others in there just for fun. I'm just going to copy and paste those all down and pick some random squares to put stuff in. So X2, Y0, say this, and X2, Y1, whoops, is, and then jump around here a bit, X0, Y2. Fun. Alright, so we've populated several squares on our grid with values. Now we need to draw those values out, so I'm going to go ahead and render them inside of my rectangle. I will say g.drawString, and the string I want to draw is strArray, and whatever position it's at in this loop, I'm going to use that x value and y value to grab the correct value from our array. So I'm going to say strArray x, y, so whatever values in that particular box of the grid that it's drawing will be drawn to the screen. And now we just need to tell it what font to use. I'm just going to use the form's default font, so I'm going to say me.font, and the color, I'll go ahead and draw it in blue for fun. And now we need to tell it where on the screen to draw, and we're going to do that the exact same way we did here. Okay. Now a point is a little different than a rectangle. It only has an x and y position on the screen. It doesn't have a height and width. So I'll just say a new point at x 64. So it's going to take the x value, multiply it by 64, and that's where it's going to start drawing on the screen. And then y times 64. And we can close that off. Alright. And let's see, is there anything else I need to think of here? Let's go ahead and just try running that and see what happens. Click on my button. Hey, look at that. Okay, so it's working beautifully. Hello YouTube, this is fun. And if you want, you can mix it and match. You know, I could move fun to the very last cell in my grid. There you go. So you can kind of get an idea of how that data is stored in that array. Works pretty good. If you want, you could also throw in the coordinates if you wanted to see that. Let's go into our draw string here, and I can say draw the x value and separate the x and y with a colon for the coordinate, concatenate on the y value, and then let's go ahead and throw a line break in there so our text drops down a line. So I'll say VBCRLF, and finally concatenate on our actual cell value. See what happens now. It should show us the coordinates of our array. As you can see, 0, 0 is hello, x1, y0 is YouTube, x2, y2 is fun. So it gives you a wonderful visual representation of how the data is stored. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and stop that. We could repeat this if we wanted. We could do the exact same thing with numbers. So let's go ahead and do that just for fun. Now this is, you know, pretty much you have an idea of what you can do here with arrays. So if you want to, you can stop the video now if you want, or you can just keep watching and we'll just kind of play with it a bit. Next up I will throw in an integer array. And I'm going to make this one 4 by 4. So I'm going to say 3, 3, 0 to 3 is 4. So, and I will store these values as integers. Alright, and just for fun, let's populate this grid with random numbers. How about that? That'll be exciting. So I'm going to say dim rnd as new random. That's a nice little random generator, random number generator. We're going to need another button here. So I'm going to take this one, make sure it's selected. I'm going to do a Control C and a Control V to copy and paste a new copy of that button on here. And this one I'm going to say 2D integer array. So going into our text property, change the value on that, and I'll call it cmd integer 2d. And double click on that new button to generate a click event. And let's do this much the same way we did our other one. I'm just going to copy and paste our clear function here, just to kind of clean up the surface. So if we've already clicked this one, it'll clean it up. Next up, we'll populate our integer array, and I'm going to do it. I'm actually going to populate this one on the click. The other one we populated in the form load. In this case, since we're just going to be throwing in random values, you know, we can really do this quickly by just doing a for x, y, and loop through the grid and populate it with random numbers. So I'm going to say for x equals 0 to 3, for y equals 0 to 3. I'm going to say int array at the x coordinate and the y coordinate, and set the value to the rnd.next. That chooses the next random number in sequence, and I'm going to just say, give it a value of 0 to 100. Now with random numbers, this number is excluded. It only goes up to the number before it, so it'll be actually 0 to 99. 100 will never show up. Just a little fact about randoms. And now we can repeat our loop. I can say for x equals 0 to 3. And this time we're going to loop through just like we did up here and draw our values. So we'll say for y equals 0 to 3. I'm going to do it just like we did before, so I'm just going to copy this guy. That draws our grid, and this will draw the information. So I'm going to copy this guy. But instead of drawing string array, I want to draw the integer array value. Alright. Let's go ahead and run that. And punch our button. So as you can see, random numbers are being drawn in the x, y coordinates of our array. So that creates a two-dimensional array of random numbers. You can keep punching the button. It will erase it with the clear and redraw it. Hit your 2D array, goes back and draws that. So that is one method of creating arrays. Now you could also create a 3D array if you wanted, and that's getting a little bit crazy because remember it grows exponentially larger, so it's like 3 times 3 times 3. That's going to be a lot of variables that you're storing in memory, especially if you have a very large array. So kind of keep that in mind. It creates literally that many variables. So not actually going to do a 3D array in this tutorial. Let's see, what else can we do with this? If you wanted, you could make an array of objects. It doesn't just have to be standard data types. You could actually create an array of classes. So if we went over to our Solution Explorer and added a new class, I could say add class, select class, and call it animal, and we could say give it some variables here. We could say public animal type equals, or sorry, as string, public color as string, public quantity as integer, and on, and you can create, you know, however you want to define your class. It can be anything. Just as a simple example, we could come over here and say dim my animals as, oh, let's create an array. How about, you know, say we have 5 animals, or that we want to, 5 sets of animals that we want to keep track of. We could say my animals for as animal. So that creates an entire array of our animals, and then you could populate that array as you see fit. And say my animals 0 equals a new animal with values dot animal type equals horse dot color equals brown dot quantity equals 2. And that would create a brand new animal and add it to your array. So then we could say message box my animals. I've only got one value in there, so if I said 1, it would be outside, you know, it would be a null value. Even though it's inside of the array, you know, I could have 5 possible animals. Because it's you know, it's got a null value, it would not return anything in our message box. So we're going to want to specify one that exists, which we've created here. We could say dot I want to know what type of animal I have. So if I run that, boom, I get a message box that tells me what kind of animal is in slot 0 of our array. So you can kind of get an idea of how we can create an array of objects. Now in Visual Basic.NET there are a number of different types of arrays. You can create lists, as new list, and you have to select the object type and have to say of animal, and that would create a list array. A list is essentially a one-dimensional array of objects, so, or data types of your choice. Just like this kind of array, you know, it just creates a one-dimensional list of whatever you desire. You know, there are also stacks, which is, I think, a top-down array. First in, last out, I think. I can't remember. So, you know, there's a whole bunch of different collection types: dictionaries, lists, queues, stacks, think hash tables, all sorts of different arrays. This is just one way of creating an array. So that concludes this tutorial. I hope it's been helpful, and I look forward to seeing you in future tutorials. If this was helpful to you, please give me a like and subscribe if you like, and if you think it would be helpful to someone else you know, I appreciate it if you share it. So I wish you all well and good luck on your projects. Thank you. Bye-bye.